It is, thank you. It's such a special day. I used to say back in the early days of WAC, if they build it, if we build it, they will come. And so here you all are, the people of God who have dared to leave the safe harbors of your established parish and continue your faith life here with us at St. Mary Magdalene. And each and every one of you here, each and every one of you on Zoom, each and every person who has ever been a part of us has been an unmitigated blessing to me. So if there was ever a line from the gospel or from life that is true, is so true, it can't be mentioned enough. It's that people go where they are being fed. Our first reading made a point of it, and Jesus made a point of it. Upon seeing the large number of folks settling down to listen to him, Jesus told his followers, go feed them. Because Jesus knew that it was only with full bellies that people can learn the word of God in order to be fed in a different way. And of course, church is supposed to feed us in that different way, but that hasn't always been true for some people. And I have to confess, it was not always true for me. If you had asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, the answer priest would never have come up, as it did for any number of my colleagues and Roman Catholic women priests who used to actually play at being priests. In fact, back in the day, I really didn't like priests very much, and I sort of found them to be insufferable. So I can remember from the time I was 8 years old, I would compare them smoking their cigars or cigarettes in their nice black cars, and then I would compare it to the life of his sisters who had to beg people for rides to go anywhere, and it just completely turned me off. So I guess I always had this keen nose for sniffing out hypocrisy. And sadly, Mass was something that I did, or else I would go to hell. And I found it boring and humdrum. And so, like, from the time I could read, and we had Missal Eph later, that took a little time past Vatican II. I would sit and open up the hymnal and read the words to the Missal, not listen to the homily, which were usually very mind-numbing. And I wasn't alone. When I grew up in Fort Richmond, there were 5 ethnic parishes, and with 5 obviously different parish communities and priests. And my aunt, who ate dinner with us every night, would shop around the different parishes to figure out which priest in which parish had the shortest Mass, so she could get, and in her words, so she could get her weekly obligation over with. Now, this was a person who prayed daily and prayed the rosary. And as I said in my Mother's Day homily, the older women in my family were much more comfortable with Mary than they ever were with the men in the church and the men in the Trinity. I think I might have also told you that during the time of the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement, I never heard one homily about working for peace and justice, even as Black people were being burned out of their homes in the community next to mine. And my dad, who was a World War II veteran, but also vehemently anti-war, delivered far more meaningful homilies in our living room about peace and justice than any priest ever did from the pulpit. And so did the folk music that I started listening to when I was in 7th grade, Peter, Paul, and Mary. So I became much more interested in hammering out justice and ringing the bell of freedom than I ever did in being a woman humble and obedient and lowly. So by the time I was 16, my attendance at church sort of slackened off because I knew that the God that I believed in would never punish me for not going to church. My God was much bigger than any spiteful human being. So in spite of my less than satisfactory relationship with the church, Larry and I did get married in the church, and we did baptize our children, and we did attend Mass in our local parish in Mount Airy, until one day in 1986, after a particularly offensive homily, I turned to Larry and I said, I'm leaving and I'm never coming back. So we did some exploration in the Episcopal and Lutheran churches, but we found them too Vatican II, in spite of the fact that there was good preaching and women ministers. And then, of course, we found St. Vincent's, which I've told you many times, because of Bud Engler's work at St. Vincent's. completely changed my life and put my feet on a not yet discerned pathway to priesthood. And I've also told you in the past how becoming a part of WAC changed my life. I mentioned the mentoring that I received from Judy Heffernan and Regina Bannon, and Judy and Regina are a big reason why I'm here. So Maria, I don't know if you remember this, in 2000, Regina, Judy, Maria and I, and several other women attended a large international WAC conference in Rochester, New York, you remember? Where I met Andrea Johnson, who's now a retired bishop. She was then the president of National WAC. And the speakers presented all sorts of theological reasons why women should be ordained, which made complete sense. And there was a woman from Austria named Christine Myers-Lumpetsberger, who is also now an RCW priest, a bishop, who had developed a program of study for women discerning to become priests. And the message from that whole conference was the Nike model, just do it, which made perfect sense to me because I'm not one to sit around and wait and behave myself and wait for men to give me something that I think I deserve to have. So at that time, we also attended Mass of Spiritus Christi. Did anybody ever hear of Corpus Christi, Spiritus Christi in Rochester, New York? Well, Corpus Christi was a traditional Catholic parish that had these marvelous ministries to the poor, and had a marvelous pastor, Jim Callan, and had a marvelous assistant named Mary Rammerman. And Mary would stand with Jim Callan at the altar wearing a deacon's stole. So of course the bishop was forced to remove Jim Callan and, cause all sort of havoc. And so the whole parish, the whole Corpus Christi parish packed up their bags and their ministries and reformed as Spiritus Christi with Jim and then Mary, who was ordained in the Old Catholic Church. They became co-pastors. So Maria and I were at that Mass, which, as Maria could attest to, was packed with people and so spirit-filled that it made people cry. It was just marvelous. And that's when my mantra, if we build it, they will come. That's when I started thinking that. So if you talk about signs from God during that same visit to Rochester, we went to Susan B. Anthony's house. Rochester is like the hotbed of sedition for everything. And then we went to the Suffrage Museum where I bought Elizabeth Cady Stanton's Women's Bible. Has anybody ever read that? That is worth getting and reading. So you might say that God was slowly setting a stage for my field of dreams, which Carol has up in her screenhouse behind me. So my oldest son, Neil, has a friend whose mother, Violet Little, is a former Catholic Lutheran pastor, now Lutheran pastor. So I was talking to Violet either shortly before or after this conference, and she told me that years before this was in 2000, some man came up to her and said, you should go into the administration building of the Lutheran Theological Seminary of Philadelphia, which is in my community, and you need to apply to be a student, and you need to be a pastor. This was a random man, she said, came up and told her that. And then she turned to me and she said, you should do the same. Talk about messengers. So I dutifully, like Violet, I dutifully applied to the seminary, which was conveniently located in my community, and I was accepted into the Masters of Divinity program. And my goal was not to be ordained, but to learn the language that the church used to oppress women. And I learned that language well. However, God had additional plans for me. So while I was saying, no, I don't want to be ordained, my classmates and my professors were saying, yes, you need to be ordained. So when I was doing my clinical pastoral experience at the very busy urban Cooper Medical Center in Camden, New Jersey, my classmates actually took a vote and told me that I had to buy a clergy shirt and wear it. That's what they did. They said, and they were right. They said, you're walking through these halls at night, you need to wear a clergy shirt. It'll protect you. So I didn't want to touch something associated with the hierarchy with a 10-foot pole. But since they voted, and it's a democracy, I went and I bought a shirt, which is in my closet still to this day. So other things were happening that steered me towards ordination. In May 2005, WAC celebrated its 30th anniversary, and we had this huge celebration in Center City in the Quaker Center. And by this time, 7 women had been ordained on the Danube in 2002, and 8 women were going to be ordained on the St. Lawrence River, and any number of women had been ordained in the Old Catholic Church. And Patricia Friesen, who had been a theology professor in South Africa and a Dominican nun for 40 years, had been kicked out of her order without any means of support. And she was the keynote speaker. Sounds familiar, Mary, doesn't it? 40 years kicked out. She was the keynote speaker at the celebration. And she was also staying at our house. So I took her around to see the historical sites in Philadelphia. She invited me to join the RCW program that summer that would proceed to ordination. So I would be ordained the following year. And Mary Lefevre told me, and I completely forgot about this, that during Patricia's visit, I had something to do, which I can't remember. So she and Mary Ann Gunther took Patricia out for a day. I had completely forgot about that. So I told my classmates and teachers at the seminary what had been offered. And one of the professors suggested that if I became a Lutheran, I would be assigned a church. And while what separates the Lutheran faith from the Roman Catholic faith is so small, it's really not even worth mentioning, I knew that that's not where I was supposed to be. And one of my professors, who had been among the very first Lutheran women ordained in the 70s, she told me point blank that the Lutheran Church was not where God wanted me to be. God, she said, wanted me to be with those increasingly hurting and disaffected Roman Catholics who needed a safe place to be church. So another messenger had spoken. So on July 31st, 2006, I walked onto a boat in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I was ordained a priest. At that time, I had no idea what priesthood outside the institution would look like. And I don't think anybody else did either. So prior to my ordination, we had a retreat at a very lovely site outside of Pittsburgh. And I recall walking outside where a warm wind began buffeting me, seemingly out of nowhere. And I stood up against the fence, and I felt like the wind was the presence of the Holy Spirit making herself known to me. And a great peace came over me. And I knew whatever was going to happen, and I would be okay. And things did happen from the start. RCWP was a very small operation with no money, and our bishops lived in Europe. So our time together was short, and we had to make the most of it. The 8 of us who were going to be ordained priests were going to have our diaconal ordination the day before our priestly ordination. Our retreat house had a chapel, and the organizer, it was affiliated with some Orthodox, like, I don't know whether it was Greek or Russian Orthodox church. So the person who organized it told the management that we were going to have Mass and we were going to have an ordination, and they were okay with that. So the first Mass we had, the women who were ordained were dressed in robes, and they gave out communion, and we could see people watching us. And one of them had a Roman collar. So the next day, we were told we could not use the chapel for anything, not for the ordination, not even for private prayer. In fact, they locked the doors of the chapel so we couldn't go in there, as if we were contaminating the place. Such is the power of a Roman collar. So we scrambled around, and we found we could rent a small meeting room in a random motel for, I think, like $100. So in that small room, next to a pool and a hot tub, was where we were ordained. And I can't even remember the name of the motel, and it's somewhere near Pittsburgh. So the next day, except for some protesters along the river, the ordination went as planned. So then we all went home, and the hard work of ministry began. As Carol mentioned last week, roughly 10 of us were members of a parish begun by a man ordained in the Old Catholic Church. And for various reasons, that fell apart, mainly because the same structures of domination that were in the institution were in this church. So then we found our chapel at Drexel United Methodist Church. So those 10 people asked me to be their priest, and I agreed. So my classmates and the professors at the seminary were right. This is what I was supposed to do. So I'd like to say that I sat on the other side of the altar for 54 years. So I knew what liturgical power looked like. And I was determined that our new parish, whose name was chosen, by the way, by the community when I was on vacation, would be a community of the people, for the people, and by the people. And so I hope you see by worshiping with us, you know what liturgy, that is, the work of the people is. And while we're obviously not perfect, because nobody is, I think we do a pretty decent job of being church. So thank God, Carol was ordained in 2011. I used to say to people, Carol saved my life, because I was working full-time as a school nurse, and I was a full-time pastor of the community, which began to grow every time the bishops did something stupid, which they continue to do with great regularity. So the latest, of course, is denying President Biden communion. And the current edition of the National Catholic Reporter records what's happening. The culture wars will send more Catholics out the exit doors, and many of them will never attend church again. But a lot of them will make their way to our doors and to the doors of other intentionally Catholic communities where diversity and differences of opinion are respected. And I always think, imagine what the world would like if we just listened and realized that it's really okay to disagree about almost anything, even vehemently, and still sit down together as a community and worship God. So here we all are together in a place that once existed in a field of dreams. And to paraphrase the Christian writer Rachel Evans held, we are God's realm, a bunch of self-exiles gathered at this table, not because we're rich, not because we're smart or good or worthy, because like the people on the mountain with Jesus, we are hungry. And we have all said yes to God's call, because we know that our faith is to be lived together, to be shared, to be spoken in the presence of other people in a community. Here we are safe because our presence together is actually a sanctuary with all the singing cicadas and tree frogs and whatever. And our sanctuary is filled with blessings, even amidst our disagreements. And so, my brothers and sisters, let us always do our very best to walk hand in hand in love, in spite of our disagreements. And let us always be a sanctuary for one another in the name of our God, who, as our second reading insists, is love over, through, and in all. And many thanks for listening to this long story. I asked a couple people, did I ever tell the story before? And people said no, but like if you heard it before, I'm sorry. That's my story, and I'm sticking with it.
Jim Power, go ahead.
Thanks, Eileen. Thanks for starting Mary Magdalene and your beautiful story. I guess the only thing I could think through the whole thing is, I guess the church that I grew up on was founded on Peter, the rock. But as you always point out, it's important to know the meaning of your leaders.